On June 12, 2026, Nigeria's Democracy Day, the man who has spent 2 decades demanding accountability from power was carried out of Unity Fountain in Abuja unconscious after police fired what he called a strange gas directly into his face at close range. The headlines say Omoyele Sowore collapsed during a protest, but the real question nobody is asking is this: why on the one day of the year Nigeria is supposed to celebrate the will of the people, did the state choose tear gas as its answer to a peaceful demand for accountability? And what does that choice tell us about how this government sees its own citizens? Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what this moment reveals about the balance of power in Nigeria right now, and why it might matter more than the headline itself. Before we go further, if you're new here, welcome. Niger Inside Desk exists for one reason: to give you the kind of analysis that goes beyond the headlines and the noise. Subscribe now, because this conversation is about to get deeper. Let's establish exactly what happened. On Friday, June 12, 2026, Nigeria's Democracy Day, the date Nigeria adopted in 2018 to honor Moshood Abiola's annulled 1993 election victory, a coalition of civic groups under the Take It Back movement organized protests across roughly 20 states, demanding action on insecurity, economic hardship, and what organizers called a shrinking civic space. In Abuja, demonstrators marched from Berger bus stop toward Eagle Square, the venue where the National Police Day was simultaneously being held. As the crowd advanced, police fired tear gas canisters to disperse them. Sowore, leading the protest, collapsed amid the chaos and was rushed to hospital. Witnesses described protesters scattering in all directions to escape the toxic smoke, with fellow activists rushing to evacuate him from the scene. Sowore himself later said on social media that police deployed a strange gas at close range, which entered his lungs and left him struggling to breathe before he collapsed. He framed it as evidence of escalating tactics to suppress dissent. Now, is this new? Not really. This is the latest chapter in a pattern. Sowore has led #RevolutionNow protests since 2019, the #Fearless in October and #EndBadGovernment demonstrations of 2024, and the #Occupy Aso Rock movement just weeks ago, where he gave President Tinubu an ultimatum: rescue the kidnapped school children across Nigeria or step down. What's different this time is the timing. This didn't happen on a random Tuesday. It happened on the day the state was simultaneously celebrating democracy at Eagle Square, while deploying tear gas against citizens exercising the very rights that day is supposed to represent. That contradiction is the story. So which institutions are actually in play here? First, the Nigeria Police Force. Under Section 40 of the Nigerian Constitution, citizens have the right to peaceful assembly. The Public Order Act requires permits for processions, but Nigerian courts, including the Court of Appeal, have repeatedly ruled that police cannot use the absence of a permit to deny the constitutional right to protest. So, legally, the starting point is clear: peaceful assembly is a right, not a privilege the police grant. Where this gets murky is in the question of dispersal. Police are permitted to use crowd control measures if a gathering becomes violent or threatens public order. But here's the deliberate ambiguity: who decides when a peaceful march becomes a threat? In this case, multiple reports describe protesters simply marching toward Eagle Square, where a police-organized event was taking place. There's no reporting of protester violence preceding the tear gas deployment. This is the pattern that should concern every Nigerian, regardless of who you voted for. When public order becomes a flexible justification that can be invoked anytime a protest gets close to a sensitive location, the right to assembly stops being a right and becomes a privilege, one that can be revoked the moment it becomes inconvenient for those in power. Second institution, the presidency itself. This is worth pausing on. In October 2025, after a similar incident at a #Free Nnamdi Kanu protest led by Sowore, the police's spokesperson publicly denied that live ammunition had been fired, insisting only tear gas was used, and that the popping sound of tear gas canisters is often mistaken for gunfire. Notice the pattern. The institutional response to these incidents is consistently to clarify what never was used, rather than to explain why force was used at all against a Democracy Day march. Has the Nigeria police force functioned as designed, as a neutral enforcer of public order, or has it increasingly become an instrument for managing political dissent? That's not a question Niger Inside Desk will answer for you, but look at the recurring cast of characters across 2024, 2025, and now 2026. The same organizer, the same tactics, the same justification. When the response to dissent becomes this predictable, it stops looking like law enforcement and starts looking like a strategy.
Now, let's get into who actually benefits from a moment like this. Because in Nigerian politics, very little happens by accident. Who gains? On the surface, it looks like nobody gains from images of a 50-something-year-old activist collapsing on Democracy Day while police in riot gear stand over him. That's a bad look for any government. But here's the deeper political calculation. For the Tinubu administration heading toward 2027, the question isn't whether this looks bad to international observers, it's whether it successfully signals to domestic opposition movements that the cost of sustained street mobilization is rising. Consider the timing. This protest came roughly a week after Sowore's #OccupyAsoRock ultimatum over the Oyo State school kidnappings, an ultimatum that explicitly called on Tinubu to either rescue the children or step down. Nigeria has a documented history of treating sustained protest movements as existential threats. The August 2024 #EndBadGovernance protest saw at least 17 deaths and over 1,150 arrests before Tinubu addressed the nation. And even then, organizers said his broadcast didn't meet their demands. A government that has been through that once has every incentive to prevent a repeat. And the fastest way to prevent a movement from building momentum is to disrupt it before the crowd grows. Who loses? Sowore, in the short term, loses a physical toll. But politically, every image of him being carried away by supporters strengthens his narrative of state repression. Martyrdom, even temporary, is currency in opposition politics. The question is whether that currency translates into broader mobilization, or whether it remains confined to the activist core that already shows up to these events. Now, who's conspicuously silent? Watch for whether the presidency issues any direct statement on this specific incident, distinct from the police's procedural denials. Compare that to how quickly the government responded with a national broadcast during the 2024 protests. Silence here would itself be a signal that the administration has calculated this incident doesn't carry enough political weight to warrant a direct response. That calculation in itself tells you something about how the government is reading its own vulnerability heading into 2027. And here's the second and third order consequence worth watching. Every time a Democracy Day protest is met with tear gas, it reinforces a narrative, fairly or not, that elections and democratic symbolism in Nigeria are increasingly performative, while the lived experience of civic participation is shrinking. That narrative doesn't need to be entirely accurate to be politically damaging. It just needs to be believable to enough people. Let's zoom out from Abuja to the country as a whole. On the federal-state power balance, this protest wasn't confined to Abuja. Organizers said demonstrations were planned across roughly 20 states, framed around hardship, insecurity, and shrinking civic space. When a protest movement achieves that kind of geographic spread, it tells you the grievances aren't localized, they're structural. This isn't a Lagos problem or an Abuja problem. It's being felt from the northwest to the south-south. Economically, the underlying grievances driving people into the streets, fuel subsidy removal, currency depreciation, the rising cost of living, haven't gone away since 2024. One figure cited by protest organizers, drawing on Amnesty International reporting, claimed over 133 million Nigerians are living in multi-dimensional poverty, with tens of thousands displaced in states like Benue and Plateau due to insecurity. Whether or not you accept every figure at face value, the direction of the data is consistent. Economic pressure is not easing, and that pressure is what turns a scheduled Democracy Day march into a flashpoint. On security, here's the uncomfortable question. If the state's visible response to a peaceful, unarmed civilian protest is tear gas at close range, what does that signal about capacity? Is this a demonstration of strength, or is it a demonstration of where the state chooses to direct resources that many Nigerians feel would be better spent addressing the insecurity that's actually driving people to protest in the first place? The same insecurity Sowore referenced just weeks earlier when discussing kidnapped schoolchildren in Oyo State. And for the Nigerian living below the poverty line, far from Unity Fountain and far from the cameras, what does this mean? It means the gap between the government's stated priorities and its visible actions on Democracy Day becomes one more data point. People don't need to watch the video to feel the message. Dissent has a cost, and the state is willing to pay it to avoid disruption. How does this look beyond Nigeria's borders? For the diaspora in London, Houston, Toronto, Johannesburg, this is the kind of footage that travels fast and shapes perception disproportionately. Images of tear gas on Democracy Day with a recognizable opposition figure collapsing on camera become shorthand. They get shared in WhatsApp groups, picked up by diaspora media, and used to frame conversations about whether Nigeria's democratic institutions are strengthening or eroding. For Nigerians in the diaspora specifically, the practical question is this: does this affect how international partners, investors, multilateral lenders, diplomatic missions assess political risk in Nigeria heading into 2027? Political risk assessments increasingly factor in civic space indicators, not just macroeconomic numbers. A pattern of crackdowns on peaceful assembly, however the government frames it, becomes part of that calculus.
Let's steelman the other side, because that's what credible analysis requires. The strongest argument from the government's perspective goes something like this. Eagle Square was simultaneously hosting an official National Police Day event. Security agencies have a legitimate interest in managing crowd movement near a venue where official state functions are underway, regardless of who's protesting. From this view, the tear gas wasn't about silencing Sowore specifically. It was a generic crowd control measure applied to a crowd that was approaching a secured area, and Sowore's collapse was an unfortunate but unintended consequence. There's also the argument that Sowore's movement has a long history of confrontational tactics, deliberately marching towards symbolically significant or restricted locations, which predictably triggers a security response. From this view, organizers know exactly what will happen when they route a march toward Eagle Square on a day when it's hosting a police event, and the resulting images serve the protest's narrative as much as, or more than, they damage the government's. Now, the misconception circulating online that this was a targeted assassination attempt or that live ammunition was used. Police have previously and explicitly denied firing live ammunition at Sowore-led protests, clarifying that the sound of tear gas canisters is often mistaken for gunfire. There's no credible reporting of live fire in this incident. Inflating the claim doesn't strengthen the underlying case. It gives critics an easy way to dismiss the legitimate concern, which is the use of force against a peaceful assembly on a day meant to celebrate democratic participation. What does this mean for Nigeria's democratic trajectory? It means the test of a democracy isn't how it treats popular, comfortable assemblies. It's how it treats the ones that are inconvenient, poorly timed, or led by people the state would rather not deal with. By that measure, this incident is a small but telling data point. So what happens next? First likely move, Sowore and the Take It Back movement will use this incident to fuel continued mobilization. Expect renewed calls for protests, framed around both the original grievances, insecurity, economic hardship, and the new grievance of state response to Democracy Day demonstrations. Second likely move, watch for whether the police issue any clarifying statements specifically on this incident, similar to the October 2025 denial of live ammunition. If they do, it will likely focus narrowly on the type of gas used and whether protesters had approached a restricted area, rather than addressing the broader question of proportionality. Third likely move, watch international and diaspora media coverage over the next 48 to 72 hours.
If this story gains traction with international outlets, not just Nigerian press, expect some form of acknowledgement from the presidency, even if indirect, similar to how the 2024 protests eventually prompted a national broadcast. The conditions for escalation. If Sowore's hospitalization reveals a more serious health impact than initially reported, or if similar tear gas incidents are documented in other states from the same day's national protests, expect this to become a unifying grievance that broadens the protest base beyond the activist core. The conditions for de-escalation. If this remains a single-day story without documented serious injury and without similar incidents reported elsewhere, it likely fades into the broader pattern, another data point in Sowore's long history of confrontations with security forces rather than a turning point. 12-month outlook. This incident on its own won't reshape Nigerian politics, but as one entry in a growing ledger alongside the Oyo kidnappings, the hashtag Occupy Aso Rock ultimatum, and the broader insecurity narrative, it contributes to a cumulative picture that opposition figures across the political spectrum, including the Obi-Kwankwaso NDC alignment, will likely reference as 2027 positioning intensifies. 3-year outlook. Whether Nigeria's civic space narrows or stabilizes between now and the next election cycle will depend less on any single incident and more on whether the underlying economic and security grievances driving people into the streets are addressed or simply managed. Now, if what you just heard challenged what you thought you knew, drop it in the comments. I want to hear your read on this before we get to the part that reframes everything. So, let's return to where we started. Why, on the one day Nigeria is supposed to celebrate the will of the people, did the state's answer to a peaceful demand for accountability come in the form of tear gas at close range? The evidence suggests this wasn't an isolated overreaction. It's part of a recognizable pattern stretching back through 2024 and 2025, where peaceful assembly near symbolically significant locations consistently triggers a forceful security response, regardless of which administration's spokesperson is issuing the denial afterwards. That doesn't mean every protest is righteous, and it doesn't mean every security response is malicious. But it does mean that the gap between Nigeria's democratic symbolism and its democratic practice remains wide, and that gap is exactly what fuels movements like Sowore's, whatever you think of his methods. I'm not telling you what to think about Sowore or about this government. I'm telling you what the pattern shows. Now, I want to hear your read. Is this a case of the state managing legitimate security concerns, or a case of dissent being treated as a threat to be neutralized? Push back on this analysis if you disagree. That's what this channel is for. And here's the thread I'll leave you with. Organizers say this protest spanned roughly 20 states. We've only talked about Abuja. What happened in the other 19, and did any of them end differently? That's a story we'll be tracking. If this analysis gave you clarity, not agreement, clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what's actually happening. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.